Hi, Josh. Thanks for taking some time to chat with us today. It's good to see you.
Good to see you. Happy to be here.
And I really appreciate you agreeing to have this conversation about monetization, which is, I think, where we'll spend most of our time here today talking. There's an awful lot of interest in that topic in the field. But before we dive into the subjects that we want to cover here today, I thought maybe we could just start, roll things back and start at the beginning and give you an opportunity to tell our listeners how it is that you got into the monetization industry to begin with.
Yeah, so it really began for me in law school. I was very interested in intellectual property, which is generally an elective in most law schools. You don't have to take it, but while I was at Yale Law, I took the intro intellectual property class, so sort of a survey of copyrights, patents, and trademarks. And I found it really interesting. After I graduated, instead of practicing law, I went to work on Wall Street for Allen and Company, which is an investment bank that traditionally has focused on media, entertainment, and technology. And while I was there, I somehow fell into being the junior guy on a whole bunch of talent and sports agency transactions. I worked on one of these deals, which at the time was pretty unusual, but then there was sort of a wave of consolidation of these types of businesses. And I guess after I worked on one of them, the next one that came in, they said, "Oh, well, you better have this guy work on it because he's the only one around who worked on one previously." So I worked on the sale of ICM, the film and literary agency, and then worked on ICM merging with another agency. I worked on the sale of a baseball and basketball agency and worked on the sale of a motorsports agency. So there was, a lot of exposure that I had to the kinds of rights and royalties that you would see in entertainment businesses and in the kinds of agencies that work with talent in the entertainment world.
A good segue into this conversation about monetization and streams of revenue. You're doing some really creative stuff, from what I understand, about monetizing the revenue streams. Can you tell us a little bit about your work there?
Yeah, I mean, just linking this back to the conversation we were having a minute ago, when I first started working with ICM, the Film and Literary Agency, what was interesting was I went into it expecting that the business was going to be quite volatile year to year because primarily they're negotiating deals for their clients, and sometimes you have a great year, sometimes you don't have a great year. But when we got under the hood, what was actually the case was that they had that business, but they also, having been around for a really long time, had accumulated all of these royalties or back end participations in films and television shows. I was working with them in the mid 2000s, and they were still cashing a check every year from the original Star Wars, and they hadn't represented George Lucas since the 70s. They were cashing a check from Pretty Woman every year, and they hadn't represented Julia Roberts since the 80s. So it was really striking to see how long term those types of revenue streams could be. Very, very predictable, very annuity like. And that made a big impression on me and had a lot to do with developing the strategy that I pursued at my own firm.
Hmm. And and we see all these big deals, right? I think it was Queen, uh, not too long, a number of months ago, sold their rights for over $1 billion. A number of years ago, Bruce Springsteen did the same for around $500 million. I mean, there's a lot of money here in these streams.
There absolutely are. Music and probably life sciences, drug royalties. Uh, I think became very mature and competitive, probably faster than a number of other areas. So you will see pricing in those areas has been pretty elevated, and we've done a few deals related to music royalties and drug royalties, but we've found that there's been more opportunity at more favorable rates of return around film and television. There, we've invested in royalties or back end participations. We've also invested in digital streaming rights, which sounds super exotic, but basically streaming is just a form of distribution, just like television, just like home video, etc. And we had a terrific investment that went on for a number of years, and then we exited recently with a company called FilmRise that's based in Brooklyn, and they acquire the digital distribution rights only. They don't necessarily need to buy the other distribution rights to older independent films and TV shows. And they earlier in they're now a pretty large company, but early in their evolution, they needed some financing to go out and pay rights holders for the right to act as the distributor for a period of years, and we provided capital to that, and it was terrific. We were able to acquire the distribution rights for digital to some really interesting things like Forensic Files, which is a 400 plus episode, 30-minute crime investigation show from the late 90s through, I think, 2010. And that has performed incredibly well on Amazon Prime Video and a bunch of other streaming platforms. So film and TV rights and royalties have been very interesting. More recently, we're doing a couple things related to video games and interactive entertainment. The video game industry overall is larger than the movie industry or the music industry, but for a variety of reasons, maybe because they don't tend to have famous celebrities involved, it gets less media attention, even though it's just gigantic in terms of revenue. And we've been doing some interesting things there, looking just as in music and film and TV, there's emerged an interest in the secondary market. Can you buy an interest in a movie or a TV show or a song that's been out for a while? We're looking at some opportunities in the secondary market around video games, which a few people have looked at, but I think it's a little bit off the beaten path at this point, not quite as well explored as music. So there's always going to be new and emerging areas of royalties and of IP interests that are out there, and it's a lot of fun to be on the hunt for them.
So let me dial this back a little bit to make sure that everybody kind of understands exactly what we're talking about here. I think a lot of attorneys might understand the monetization of a stream in terms of you've maybe settled a case for your client. Your client maybe gets a lump sum and maybe gets some money coming in monthly thereafter, for example, maybe for some kind of product liability or some basic tort kind of an action. And for whatever reason, the client doesn't want to wait to get that stream coming in, and then they go and they sell that stream to an investor who then pays them a certain amount of money up front, and then they get the stream going to them. Is that a good analogy for what you're doing with IP rights and intangible assets?
So I would say that for us, it's on a spectrum of how certain is the amount that you are expecting to receive in the future. So if it's completely certain, I would call that factoring. And we do have investments related to factoring. For example, we have invested in a company called Grey Cube Sports, and they provide structured capital solutions for professional soccer teams. Their most significant product is they will factor player transfer fees. So in the soccer world, you have a $10 billion a year market where teams trade players with each other. They have long-term contracts on the players. They can sell those contracts to other teams. And there are teams, particularly in emerging markets, that will develop players from a young age. If they prove to be stars, those teams may sell them to teams in developed markets like the US or the UK or Europe. And so Grey Cube will go to those teams and they sell a player, and let's say they know they're going to get 5 payments spread out over the next year and a half, and they know exactly what those payments are going to be. And Grey Cube will offer to just accelerate those payments and pay them cash up front at a discount. So there we know, unless something goes wrong, we know exactly what the amounts are. We even know exactly when those amounts are scheduled to be paid. So that's like pure factoring. Now, with something like the FilmRise investment, where you have distribution rights that you're acquiring, and then you have to go out and actively set them up on different platforms and see how they perform on those platforms, that's a different kind of risk profile, because there we are exposed to the possibility that, well, what if a title underperforms? What if it doesn't perform as well as expected? And so, obviously that's a different risk profile. Hopefully, you would underwrite that to a higher return to reflect the risk profile. But the different kinds of things that we invest in are going to fall on a spectrum with respect to how certain that future amount is.
Now, is it also a situation where it really doesn't matter what the intangible right is or intellectual property right is? If there's a stream that can be evaluated from an economic standpoint, I suppose, or financial standpoint, then that would be something that you might be interested in?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it matters in the sense that I want to understand what is the underlying claim. Is it a copyright? Is it a patent? Is it a trademark? Is it something else? But
Yeah,
we'll
that's like the Warren Buffett rule, right? You only invest in stuff you understand, which is why he invested in Coca-Cola and Dairy Queen and stuff like that.
Right. But I think that the point that you were getting at is that we view these things maybe a little bit more holistically than some other people do. I mean, there are dedicated drug royalty funds. They're only going to invest in drug royalties. There's dedicated music royalty funds. They're only going to invest in music royalties. I we like to look at it a little bit more holistically than that, and to look at a range of media, sports, and IP related opportunities. Actually, media, sports, and IP is what we've been focusing on a lot in the last couple of years. It's not the only thing that we look at. We historically have also done investments related to litigation finance, insurance related investments, several different kinds of hard assets that we've invested in. But about 80% of the capital we've deployed in the last 2 years has been related to media, sports, and IP. We see a lot of deal flow there, and it's sort of top of mind for us. But within that zone, we're going to be pretty holistic in looking at opportunities and looking for what we think are the best risk reward.
And are you out? I mean, how does this work? Do people come to you? Do you look for opportunities? Do you reach out? Is it a situation where if somebody has a catalog of one sort or another that has a stream of revenue coming in that they can reach out to you and say, hey, would you take a look at this or would you be interested? What's the mechanics?
Of how we source deals?
Yeah, I suppose that's the right answer because one of the questions whenever whenever I talk to people about money, it's people's like, well, how do I know if I have something that they might be interested in? Number one, and then number two, how do I go about if I do have something that they might be interested in? How do I go about actually appropriately making the introductions or inquiries from a business responsible level? And I say it like that because I get myself, people reach out to me all the time, and the ones who reach out in a business appropriate way through proper channels, obviously you give more credence to them than just somebody who, happens to get your email and sends you an email with misspelled words in it, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that our favorite way to do sourcing is really through our personal relationships. I mean, we've been doing it for a while. We've got a pretty good network. We've told a lot of people the kinds of things that we're looking for, and it generates a lot of interesting deal flow where somebody will call me up and say, I saw this royalty stream. Somebody's looking for financing. It's a smaller deal, so there's a lot of big funds that probably won't look at it. Do you think this is something you might want to take a look at? So a lot of it is going to be just going out and spreading the word and letting people know what we do and letting people give me a shout when they see something that they think would be interesting to me. It's particularly great when somebody that we've done business with before says, "Hey, I know somebody or I'm advising somebody and they're doing something interesting and you should take a look at it." So that's pretty important. And then when we do enter into a financing partnership with a company, we'll usually try to build in some capacity rights for the future. So we'll say, look, okay, we're providing you $20 million of capital or whatever, but if this is, since we're often coming in pretty early in the life cycle of the company, we'll say, this is great, but if you originate another 200 million of this kind of stuff, we'd like first crack at being able to finance that as well. And having done this for a while, we now have a bunch of kind of repeat relationships with companies where we know that we have capacity if they need more capital to go out and do whatever they do, be it originating soccer player transfer fees or originating the digital distribution rights to films and TV shows or whatever the activity of that company may be.
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting stuff. It's a different way, I suppose, of getting paid because a lot of things, particularly with smaller companies, and they'll have some money coming in, but they have needs today, and they're trying to expand, and they're trying to move forward. And getting capital today can be so incredibly important to their success, their long-term success.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the exciting parts of our business is getting to help companies that are doing really innovative things grow. We were just named to Inc.'s founder friendly list for this year, founder friendly investors, and we were really excited about that. We love rolling up our sleeves and helping somebody who's got a really interesting idea grow their company. And when that works, it's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's really probably not going to be an easy way to pivot to the next topic that we wanted to talk about. So we can come back to anything else if you have anything else you want to say. But I want to make sure that we have some time here to talk about artificial intelligence because I know in the conversations that we've had leading up to this recording, we talked about monetizing AI and what investors and companies should be doing to prepare for some of the decisions that we expect are probably going to be coming out over the next months or certainly over the next year or so on the copyright front and on other fronts. And then just generally speaking, what should creators, company owners, and people in that industry, investors, in your opinion, what should they be focusing on?
Well, first of all, I think that there, at least investors, are potentially focusing too much on the technology of AI, which already is relatively widespread. Like, there's quite a few companies that are all developing large language models, for example, which appear to have, fairly similar capabilities. So I think people are spending too much time thinking about technology, and they're not spending enough time thinking about the legal environment around the technology, particularly the intellectual property issues. And the intellectual property issues with AI are both on the input side and the output side. The input side is the training data. Can the AI companies just use whatever training data they can get their hands on? And is that somehow fair use? Or do they have to pay for the training data because it falls under the copyright laws? And on the output side, you have some really interesting questions about whether the discoveries from AI systems can be patented and whether creations of AI systems can be copyrighted. And right now, the the patent and copyright offices are taking the position that no, they can't. And there's been some federal court decisions, although to my knowledge, not yet a Supreme Court decision that have backed up the copyright and patent offices on that. But that area is very much in flux. But I think that a lot of the value in the whole AI ecosystem, is going to relate to who owns the inputs and who owns the outputs, and that is going to be shaped by law, not by technology per se. And it reminds me to some extent. I think we talked about this earlier of the battles around piracy in the entertainment industry in the 80s and 90s. Initially the music industry, for whatever reason, had put out on CDs unencrypted digital information about songs, so it was very easy to copy CDs, and they ended up in a huge piracy challenge, which thankfully the music industry is now back in excellent health at the high level, in the sense that streaming has kind of more than made up for the revenue shortfalls that came about earlier. But for a while there, it was looking pretty dicey. The movie industry was really savvy about it. I mean, they were protected a little bit initially just by technology, in the sense that there's a lot more data involved in a movie than a song. So it was a little harder with current technology to copy movies rather than songs. But what they did, which was really clever, we actually looked at this in the copyright class that I took in law school, was the Motion Picture Administration, the lobbying group for the movie industry, got into the Digital Millennium Copyright Act a provision that made it unlawful for any hardware or software developer to circumvent a copyright protection system. And they put a relatively weak encryption system on DVDs. So it wasn't really that the DVDs had this amazing unbreakable encryption, but they had mild encryption that it was actually a violation of law to try to circumvent. And so no reputable hardware or software manufacturer was going to make it easy for you to copy a DVD. I'm sure there were some hackers who could figure out how to copy a DVD, but it was not nearly as easy to do. And so I sort of feel like the lesson there was the law trumped the technology of the situation. The technology wasn't really preventing anybody from copying DVDs at a certain point, but the law was definitely making it a lot harder to do that. So to my mind, that's sort of a lesson for the whole AI economy in terms of law has a tendency, once it gears up, to sort of trump technology.
Yeah, that was very clever, very smart. Because otherwise they would have just had to rely on contributory infringement or inducement, and those theories are really tough to prove, and particularly so in a technology-centric application. Because if there winds up being any kind of legitimate, lawful use of that technology, then it winds up being, no matter what you did, no matter what your purpose really was behind the scenes, it's not infringing.
Right.
So having that protection in DMCA, I think was very smart. They probably learned their lesson and saw things a little bit clearer. I wonder what lessons there are there, or if you've thought about that with respect to AI. And I also want to just talk to you about, do you have any thoughts on whether this stuff is fair use? Is it not fair use on the input or on the output side? Which I think the input side analysis and the output side analysis are a little different. I don't think I come to any different ultimate conclusions, but it requires some finessing of the facts and the law to apply to something that really wasn't envisioned when the law was written.
So I was sort of surprised when I looked at the New York Times versus Microsoft lawsuit and saw that there was a fair use defense that was being attempted there. I sort of thought that they were going to try to claim that they weren't really copying the material at all, and to try to somehow argue that the way in which they were ingesting it wasn't really copying it, even though that might not sound very plausible. But the use of fair use there as a defense seems very implausible to me. You know, the way I learned fair use, it was really, you know, it's as you know, it's a 4-part statutory test, and it was really crafted to try to protect things like classroom instruction, or if a film or book critic is going to write a review of something, like it looks, among other things, at the amount and totality of the copying. If you copy something, it looks at whether your activity is commercial or nonprofit in nature. You know, it looks at what effect your activity is having on the market for that product or service. And it seems to me this isn't a tough decision. Like the activity that's going on here, you know, at least according to the complaints that are being brought by New York Times, Getty Images, whatever, involves complete copying of articles, images, etc. The usage is completely commercial. No one's making any claim that this is, you know, oh, we're trying to teach students or something. It's completely commercial by multi-billion-dollar business enterprises. And to the extent that these businesses could enter into licensing programs if they weren't having the material taken from them, like, it affects the market for the work. Because, you know, if I say, hey, I'll license you this video for $6 a minute, and you say, thank you very much, I'm just going to ingest it anyway for free. You know, you just deprived me of $6 a minute. So I I just do not see fair use being an effective defense here.
I don't either. And if it is, then I don't know what good copyright laws are because they're taking 100% of not just one or two works, but of entire databases of creative work. And but even if on the front end if we wind up being wrong, you and I wind up being incorrect, and then some judge ultimately, and it stands up on appeal, says that this is fair use, you still have the problem of the output, right? Because I do hear the creators talking about, well, if you, Eugene, you could go and read all of this stuff and then you could use that knowledge. Well, yeah, I mean, I could read it all. I could use that knowledge. But if I started regurgitating precisely what I read, and if you asked me, hey, send me the lyrics to this song, and I did, and they were word for word the same, it wouldn't matter whether on the front end what I was doing was legitimate because on the back end I gave you a copy.
Yeah, no, I see your point. I mean, I think that if the outputs are substantially similar to the original inputs, then that I agree with you. That seems like a textbook violation of copyright. And I guess I should add that to the list of things that I listed earlier as things that you need to think about for outputs as far as intellectual property is concerned. I was jumping into the question of if there's stuff that appears to be original as like a creation or a discovery, can it be copyrighted
Right,
or
right.
patented? But you're raising the other point, which is what if there's the outputs have substantial similarities without licensing to inputs that are subject to copyright, and yeah, that's another copyright violation right there.
Yeah, and I mean, I get why the lawyers are making these arguments because fundamentally, they almost have to because right now the AI that we have, the generative AI at least, requires so much data
Yeah.
to train these models that if they can't take it for without paying for it, they say that they couldn't move forward. Well, that to me calls into question the business model. Um, and I think a lot of investors should have asked these questions before they started investing. And it's frustrating, I get, because the law always trails technology, and when there's a dispute, the answer always trails the disagreement. But I think some of these lawsuits, which are characterized as existential threats for AI, they could have been predicted, and I think they could have been handled a lot better going into these things with open eyes and negotiation on the front end.
I I think there might be some pretty big damages awards on a one-time basis, but I don't think this issue is necessarily an existential threat to the AI industry. There's going to be some kind of market clearing price for all of this stuff to be used as training data, whether it's
Mm.
text, images, video, geospatial data, whatever it's going to be. Like there's going to be some kind of market clearing price, and um, I mean, there's no doubt that what AI is going to bring to the world is going to have tremendous value. So presumably, there's going to be companies that generate a lot of profit, which means that they'll have the financial ability to pay large amounts of money to license the data. But it does suggest to me, if that's where it's going, that there's going to be some pretty interesting markets for aggregating and distributing this kind of data. And obviously, the New York Times doesn't necessarily need an intermediary to go and license their data to open AI if that's what's going to end up happening. But there's lots and lots and lots of smaller content owners, and it's not going to make sense for OpenAI to go and talk to every single little content owner around the world. And you see in other uses things clearinghouses like the Copyright Clearance Center that perform kind of group licensing functions, and it'll be very interesting to see whether the market in for AI training data develops in that kind of mold.
Yeah, I think it has to, right? In a ASCAP BMI kind of mold, we know how to do this with a whole lot of dominant players, and then some of the smaller players like the one-hit wonders. They get a great song and it gets hit and it's on the radio all the time. It gets played at weddings or what have you. Then they get money too. The formula's already there. I think it has to look something like that. And I also wonder, and I wonder whether you think about this as an investor as well. I wonder whether these AI models, they're at some point in time, they're just going to have to strip them down and start all over. Because I think it's frustrating that so often they're using as training data stuff that is extremely unreliable. It's like they capture everything on the internet, and one of the truisms we learned very early on in the internet, you can't believe everything you read on the internet. And it seems like a lot of these solutions right now are they're not really being coded to try and give you the right answer. They're trying to predict what the next word is. And that's a great start. I mean, what they're doing is remarkable. But I just wonder whether we're going to need to have like generative AI 2.0, like a real advance in order to get to the promise of like the Star Trek computer, for example.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't want to go too deep in terms of making predictions about the technology of it because that's not really my area. But I think that it's developing extremely quickly. I do think that the large AI companies are pretty choosy about what kind of training data they want their models to ingest. And it does seem like new foundational models are being developed pretty frequently, at least in this point of time. So I would assume that they're going to need to retrain on data relatively frequently. But this is a very new area, and are models going to develop that where the data they've been trained on can just be ported or distilled into other models without requiring retraining? I mean, it's probably too early to be confident in any kind of prediction around that. But I think for the time being, it seems like they need to retrain pretty frequently.
Yeah. So, what do you think investors should hear and internalize? And maybe what are you internalizing here in terms of AI? Is it just too much uncertainty right now to get involved, or is that uncertainty creating opportunity as long as you assess the risk properly?
Well,
What,
I mean, I think it's a little hard to generalize about all investors because I think you have to divide people into categories in terms of what they're investing in. Are you talking about public markets? Are you talking about private markets? If you're talking about private markets, are you talking about people who are making very large scale venture capital investments in big AI companies? Are you talking about funds like mine that are kind of looking to invest in rights and royalties and other kinds of specialty finance instruments? I think I'm not a public markets guy, so take it with a grain of salt. I think if you're looking at public markets, I think it would be pretty interesting to go and look right now at which publicly traded media companies have copyright infringement lawsuits going against the major AI companies, and taking a look at whether the size of the potential damages awards is really priced into their share price and their market cap at this point. So I think that would be a kind of an interesting exercise. In terms of what I focus on, I mean, I'm really interested in rights and royalties and payment streams of one kind or another, and figuring out how to provide financing to companies and rights holders that are involved in or have interests in these kinds of cash flow streams. I'm interested in exploring this whole question of training data, who owns it, how do you aggregate it, is it about to have a huge step up in value, are there some interesting things to invest in there? So that would be one thing that's very interesting. And then the other thing that I'm kind of following, and I'm really interested to see how it develops, is I feel like the courts are going to have to come up with a more nuanced perspective on whether outputs can be copyrighted or patented. It just seems hard to believe that if you have hybrid activities where human creators or inventors are working with AI systems to develop stuff, there's going to have to be some sort of standard for if there's enough human input, even if a chunk of it is being done by the AI. It still is going to be the case that only a natural person can be the copyright holder, let's say, or the patent holder. I don't think that's going to change, but I think that there's going to have to be some definition of, when the human effort is blended with the AI to produce a creation or a discovery. And once that starts to happen, it's going to have really interesting implications because it's going to massively amplify the productivity of creators and inventors.
Yeah. I do think at some point in time we have to have a real conversation about the AI creating without any human involvement, because if what you're doing is you're creating something that doesn't take a whole lot of time, money, and energy to either make, manufacture, market, that's one thing. But we're seeing hopes that AI is going to revolutionize drug discovery. It's going to do all kinds of wonderful things to problems that take a lot of time, money, energy, testing in order to make sure that they're ready for the marketplace. So if what we want is that type of innovation that really requires a lot of investment on the front end, I don't think we can say, oh, well, this was the germ here was only created through AI, so nobody gets any protection, because we know what that world looks like. When you can't get any protection, you can't invest billions of dollars to take something across the finish line and put it into the marketplace. So I don't know what that's going to look like. I think maybe it'll be some sui generis protection for AI, and for those people who maybe ask the AI the question are the ones who are pushing the product into the marketplace. But there's a lot more questions than answers right now, and that has to be depressing. The market probably has to be depressing investment.
There's a lot more questions than answers right now. That I agree with you.
Yeah. So, but you're not shying away. You're still looking at opportunities, and if good opportunities, if the figures add up and things look good, then you're still optimistic.
Absolutely. And I don't want to be overly specific about it, but we're looking at some opportunities related to training data aggregation that I think could be very interesting.
Yeah, and whenever you're investing and when you're ever trying to make money, if you're kicking the tires and looking and you see something good and you're in early, that's when you make your money. I think that's what people ought to be doing, is it's doing due diligence for sure, but I do think there is a lot of opportunity here.
There's no doubt about that.
Oh, thanks for being here. It was great to talk to you. Thanks a lot, Josh.